welcome to the Way Out Show. I'm your host, Dane McCarthy, broadcasting to you from FEMA Region 5, deep in the heart of the United Police State of Amnesia. Today is March 13th, 2015. And I have about 4.5 minutes of video to show you from The Late Show. And on that video, you will see a very interesting person who you are all familiar with, who's speaking about the recent events in Ferguson in which 2 police officers were shot, supposedly, and he kind of explicates a little bit on the details of it. And I'm going to just run that, and then I'll make some comments on it, and then we'll move on to another topic. So let's roll that video first.
Very late last night for you in Washington, D.C. Yeah. In Ferguson, 2 police officers were shot, and thank goodness
thankfully they're okay.
They're at home now and they're out of the hospital. And especially, you gave a beautiful speech in Selma last Saturday talking about these very subjects, about civil rights, the past, the present, the future of civil rights. Does that make it especially painful for you when something like this happens?
Obviously, we don't yet know what happened. Our thoughts and prayers are with the officers and their families, and thankfully, as you said, they're going to be okay. What was beautiful about Selma was reminding ourselves that real social change in this country so often has happened because ordinary people are willing in a nonviolent fashion to make their voices heard. And I think that what had been happening in Ferguson was oppressive and objectionable and was worthy of protest. But there was no excuse for criminal acts. And whoever fired those shots shouldn't detract from the issue. They're criminals. They need to be arrested. And then what we need to do is to make sure that like-minded, good-spirited people on both sides, law enforcement who have a terrifically tough job, and people who understandably don't want to be stopped and harassed just because of their race, that we're able to work together to try to come up with some good answers. And I think I put together a task force after the original Ferguson event had taken place that had police officers, police chiefs, and some of the organizers of protests both in Ferguson and in New York, young people. And they came up with some terrific recommendations and found that there's a lot of common ground. And what we have to make sure of is that the folks who disregard and disrespect the other side, people who resort to violence, that they're marginalized. And
they set us all back. They do, yeah.
They do. But they're not the majority. And in the same way that you can't generalize about police officers who do an extraordinarily tough job, overwhelmingly they do it professionally. You can't generalize about protesters who, it turns out, had some very legitimate grievances. The Justice Department report showed that they were being stopped. African Americans were being stopped disproportionately, mainly so the city could raise money, even though these were unjust. And
I can't imagine how frustrating that must be. I mean, I get crazy, and I'm not joking, about when I get like parking tickets that I feel are unjust, and to be put in a situation like that, I do really. Like, my wheels are not turned properly, and I feel like they're just trying to make money off of me. They're not obeying the spirit of the law.
Well, and what was happening in Ferguson was you had city government telling the police department and that stop more people, we need to raise more money. Folks would get stopped, they'd get tickets, then they'd have to wait in line to pay it, take a day off work. Folks would lose their jobs. In some cases, they were thrown in jail because they didn't have enough money for the fines. And then they'd get fined for that. So there was a whole structure there, according to the Justice Department report, that indicated both racism and just a disregard for what law enforcement's supposed to do. And as I said before, I said this at Selma, it is not unique, but it's also not the norm. And we've got to constantly, when we're thinking about issues of racial progress or any kind of issue, recognize that things get better, but there's still more work to do. And we shouldn't be complacent about the very real existence of problems out there, but we shouldn't despair and think nothing's changed. If people of goodwill, which is the overwhelming majority of Americans, are working together, these are problems we can solve.
The President of the United States is here. We'll be right back.
Okay, so there you have about 4.5 minutes of President Obama going into a little bit of detail about this new development in Ferguson. As you know, the protests are ongoing, and the conflict between the police department and the population of Ferguson, Missouri, is continuing to bubble and boil. We have to consider, though, that number one, it is a possibility. I'm not saying I know for a fact, but it is a possibility, and it's something that should be looked into, that it might have been an agent provocateur that shot the two policemen, if indeed they really did get shot. For one thing, you have to sort of assume that no one is carrying a rifle in that crowd and shot them with a rifle from the crowd. And even with a rifle, because unless you're a darn good shot, even with a rifle from some distance, it's unlikely you're going to be hitting a police officer. And I'm sure for one thing, those police officers probably had vests on. They almost certainly had bulletproof vests on. So you have to shoot them somewhere where there's it is not the vest, and that's difficult. And then if you have a handgun, it's really hard to hit someone, unless you're an expert, from any distance at all, 20 or 30 feet maybe at the most. It's extremely easy to miss someone with a handgun from any distance away at all. It's hard to believe that the crowd could have been that close to the police officers. And so what really happened, we absolutely have to question. Obama himself admitted that there's a lot of problems with the police department with corruption. They're skimming money off. I don't think he mentioned this, but they're letting their friends off from getting tickets and letting them out of having to pay. And this would be very, very common among police departments. They let off friends and family. It's part of the perks. They consider that their right, and that's almost probably many places around the world to be that way. And then you have the situation, and he says they're targeting black people. Well, I believe that Ferguson is mostly black people, and it's a very small town, and it's a suburb of St. Louis. My understanding is that there are a lot of problems with police and local populations around Missouri. I've always heard that these difficulties have been ongoing in Missouri. Probably in these areas, the low-income areas, you have an adversarial relationship between the police and the population anyway. And the people are suspicious of the police are suspicious and fearful of the people, and so whenever there can be conflict, there is conflict. Some of the policies, and Obama talked about this, the policies of the government encourage getting that revenue stream flowing to pay for whatever. There's all kinds of things going on like that around the country. It's not just that. You have these confiscations of, you name it, cash, cars, other belongings of anybody who's arrested, particularly for drugs, because they say, oh, well, this car was from a drug runner, and therefore it's evil money and we need to take it away from them. And it ends up in being sold at auction, and then the money goes into the police fund. And I've even heard stories of police officers or the police chief or whatever really liking a particular car and then trying to find a way to bust the owner of that car just because they like the car. And this is ongoing corruption. I used to think that America was less corrupt than most other countries, at least maybe with the exception of certain European countries. But now I'm beginning to think that it's not so much so. In many areas, we do have, I think, pockets of where people are still, their police are really straight up good guys, and it's just a few bad apples. It's the old story. But let's be more wary about these stories, which are extreme headline grabbers, because you can never tell for sure if the story is actually accurate. Now, I'm not saying that Obama knows what really happened about the 2 police officers shot in Ferguson. He may not. All he may know is what he's told, what he's read in the media, and he's as clueless about the truth of the matter as we have. I haven't seen or really looked into what happened in Ferguson. But I can say this. I've looked into many other events of violence against the police, against the government, and over and over and over, we see evidence of fakery, of chicanery, of shenanigans going on, like, for instance, in the Charlie Hebdo whole terrorist event in Paris, in France. Just looking at the videos that was released publicly about that, even my own mother, who's 92, noticed that the street that the 2 terrorists were walking down after they shot the people, and then they shot this police officer, supposedly, was empty. The whole length. They had a convenient person up on a roof shooting video. There was a couple of people shooting video who caught these 2 so-called terrorists, or whoever they were, after having shot all these people in the editorial offices of a Parisian satirical magazine that had been really down on Muslims, and actually satirical of a lot of people, not just Muslims, but in a very harsh way, almost as if calculated to piss them off, knowing exactly what to do in order to get a reaction. And then you have this happen. But just the simple fact that it was during working hours, otherwise those people would not have been in the office. It couldn't have been early on a Sunday morning. That's the only time that the streets of Paris would be empty, and maybe not even then, actually, the reality being. Anybody who's been to Paris knows that it is an extremely busy city. There are a lot of cars. And it makes you think, okay, what's going on with this street? How could my 92-year-old mother notice this, that there's something odd about an empty street in Paris with the camera view? You get a view of at least a half mile, quarter mile anyway, of street. 3 blocks with no cars on it, except the one car that has the 2 terrorists in it. Okay, another aspect to this which makes you think this is very strange. These guys are behaving in a very professional manner, using the hand signs that would be associated with the military, that are used in special forces, things like this, and very efficiently killing a large number of people, which is hard to do for a non-professional. Only a trained assassin has the skills to be able to do that. And then, at the very same time that they're so professional and so quick, and they manage to escape, they yet accidentally leave their ID in the car when they abandon the car, which is stolen. One of the assassins, the two guys, literally, they found his ID. I mean, is there anybody who could possibly accept that at face value, that could have happened? It's virtually impossible that could have happened. And so, of course, the police were led directly to the two guys that they said did it and killed them in a televised shootout, which was also suspect. But before I go there, we have people who have looked at the video that was shot from the rooftop, very conveniently, of one of the terrorists supposedly killing a police officer. And you can see him lying on the street, and then the terrorist with the big rifle, the AK-47, or whatever it was, it probably was that, had a face mask on, dressed in black, shoots him in the head. Okay. And he immediately goes limp, like this, dead. Just like in the movies, right? In the movies, you shoot him, down, dead. Only one problem with that. For one thing, no blood. Usually blood pours out of their head immediately, instantly, pours out. Big pool of blood. No blood. And also, as many people have analyzed that particular scene, you can see a puff of smoke rise from the sidewalk as instantly, when he shoots that gun, boom, you immediately see the puff of smoke. So either he was shooting a blank, which actually, there is something that comes out in a blank. It's not just nothing, but something comes out, a little bit of paper or wadding or something, and will hit the sidewalk. Or it might have been a round that missed him. And also the fact that he also didn't twitch. When a person is dying, they don't just dead like that. Even if they're hit in the head, there's going to be some movement of that person. I hate to get gruesome, but that's just a reality. You don't just go limp instantly in a situation like that. Okay, then they show the televised big shootout in which the two guys are killed. And there's a fire in the house, and they're surrounded by police. They're shooting. And all of a sudden, a guy runs out of the building, and it's glass, so you can see him come to the door, and then he's instantly shot by a couple of guys. But there's one problem with this scene. Okay, they say, okay, that's him trying to escape, and they shot him. His hands are tied. If you slow it down, you look at it frame by frame, you can see his hands are actually tied. So all we can think of is that it was a show. They had the two guys in there. They had them secured, and he made a break for freedom, one of them. And they shot him right there on the spot, in front of the cameras. But a close look at that scene will show what is very clear, that his hands are tied. That is my interpretation of what that is about. And these are all available. You can look at them. There's thousands of people around the world who spent a lot of time examining this and analyzing all these events, these very public events. And they're looking for clues to try to solve the issue and kind of try to get to the truth of the matter. So it looks like there was a lot of chicanery that was in the Charlie Hebdo event. And that was considered to be the Parisian, or the French, 9/11. And why do I say that? Because as a result of that particular attack, supposedly an attack on free speech, what happens? You have that very thing results, an attack on a shutdown of free speech. Why? To protect you from those who would try to shut down your free speech. Because they use, the people who are the bad guys like to use free speech, and it's not necessarily directed at a satirical magazine, but it's directed at people who are using free speech to question the government, to criticize the government, to rant and rail against government. This is really all that it comes down to. In America, we have the PC movement that is against hate speech. Well, what is hate speech? And there we're told, well, it's against anybody who, questions someone who, or criticizes someone who has an unusual or variant or deviant lifestyle. Someone who's different, someone who doesn't fit in. Well, okay, that's one thing. But the actual purpose is to provide a framework to give the government the ability to restrain free speech when it is considered to be hate speech in general. Hate speech is an extremely vague term, and it often is applied to those who question government policy. Anti-government. I don't know how many times I've seen the Southern Poverty Law Center demonize anti-government groups as hate groups. And they always take ones like the Aryan Nations or something. Oh yeah, they're like the Aryan Nations, anti-government. Well, there's a lot of very perfectly benign groups that are not happy with the policies of the U.S. government. And even those that don't like the whole system of the U.S. government, or say that the system is so compromised that it doesn't even operate like the system was originally meant to operate and as enshrined in the Constitution. And we already have plenty of the memos and the directives that are given to law enforcement about what to look for when you're looking for a terrorist. And one of the criteria is that that person may have an obsession with the American flag, may have an obsession or carry around a Bible or talk about the Bible, could be the Constitution, obsessed with the Constitution, talking about the Second Amendment or various other amendments. And all these things make that person a person of interest and someone who needs to be watched as a possible terrorist threat. The whole domestic terrorism thing, I've been talking about this for years. It's been going on for 6 or 8 years that they've been readying the American people for the idea that the terrorists are not in Europe, the terrorists are not in the Middle East, the terrorists are not in Central Asia, the terrorists are not in Africa. The terrorists are here. They're in the United States. They're at your workplace. They're living around the corner. They're hiding in little cells, sleeper cells, and that they are ready to pounce at the correct moment, at the right moment. And we have to be watchful and wary. And that, but this is why the American, and of course the American government knows this, and they're getting ready. They're getting ready for the war on terrorism to come home. And they will protect us. Don't worry, we just need more money and we need more power, a lot more power, and we can protect you. And so what we have to look forward to, unfortunately, in the future is a demonstration of domestic terrorism that shakes the very foundation of this country to its core and shakes up the people. Much like 9/11. It would be the other shoe dropping from the events of 9/11, which had a horrific psychological and spiritual effect on Americans. It was shown endlessly on American television and around the world, and literally gave people who saw it, some of them, PTSD or a mild form of PTSD. I believe I even had a mild form of PTSD after seeing the events on television. Hard to believe, because I would look at a clock, a digital clock, and if it turned 9/11, you know how they click, 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 9/11, 9/12, 10 o'clock, 10:01. When it hit that 9/11, there would be a reaction. And even 8/11, 7/11, they were, it was that profound. It lasted about a year or two. But it was a shock, it was a deep, almost a physical sense of shock that we all received at that time. And it was meant to happen that way. It was meant to happen. I'm convinced of it. We've seen the evidence, the Mount Everest of very hard evidence that shows a criminal element involved in 9/11, and we can never forget this because it had such. It is the most important event of the 21st century in the United States so far, and maybe worldwide even, because virtually all of our foreign policy and much of our domestic policy regarding law enforcement stems directly from that incident. There was so many questions that were unresolved and are still to this day unresolved that were raised by the events of that day, that there is no way that it deserves that those unresolved questions that they could possibly be ignored by people. And many of those questions have actually been resolved, and it points to a false flag attack, but they will not be revealed to the mainstream public. To the state-run media, they will not be revealed. They never will be revealed, no matter how damning and how big the Mount Everest of evidence gets. It will not be revealed. Why will it not be revealed? It will not be revealed because any broadcaster, any anchor, any investigative reporter who goes there will be instantly reviled. They will lose their jobs. They will be harassed. They will become an outlier. Remember that term, outlier. That is newspeak for anyone who does not agree with the mainstream or the state agenda. And this is across the board in all kinds of different disciplines. I have a friend who's studying communication, getting his PhD in communication, and he uses that term. He's told me that they use that term in his classes, the outlier. So if you are not agreeing with the state-run evidence, you are an outlier, you are an outcast, you are an outlander, you are a suspect, you're a potential terrorist. And of course, since the passage of the National Defense Authorization Act and the Patriot Act and many other bills, You could be jailed permanently for life without due process, without a trial, and you could be disappeared. This is the way the laws are read. Though they're very broad, they're extremely vague. This is the way that the laws were in George Orwell's 1984. No one really knew what the law was in George Orwell's 1984. They didn't know for sure if what they were doing was legal or not. And that's what we're getting to the point. The Congress is being pushed, and has already done this. They have passed laws in which they are not even allowed to see the full content of the bill before they pass it. Only after it passes are they allowed to see it. And these are complex legal documents, sometimes hundreds or even thousands of pages long, in which the average congressman has difficulty even understanding the language, the ramifications of the language, the subtleties of the language that can make what appears to be a statement which says something, one thing, actually means something else, and he just doesn't catch it. They bury the heart of the law. So they're passing laws and they don't even know what's in it. This is the transparency that was promised to us by Barack Obama at the beginning and when he was running for president. And the complete opposite has happened. We're almost getting used to, as Americans, being lied to by our leadership, and they have set up the system so that they can lie to us with no repercussions on themselves. A police officer, anyone in law enforcement can now legally lie to you. They can trick you, they can entrap you, all kinds of methods that they can use that they have told us and enshrined in law as being legitimate. Whereas we are not allowed to lie to them. They can film us, they can track us, they can trace us, but again, it's a double standard. If you are trying to film, track, or trace the actions of law enforcement, then many times they have a problem with that. And I'm not trying to be completely negative here. There are efforts by many very well-meaning and right-thinking people who see the direction in law that this is going, and these people are in law enforcement. These people are in the military, and they see that, you know, we've got to turn this around. And very often they know more about what's really going on than we do, because they're in it. They see it every day. They see how the law enforcement is repurposed and it becomes more militarized. And also they're seeing that the military is becoming more like the police, and they're blending. And this is what happens in a police state. And we're more and more approaching that. And whether or not Barack Obama is actually trying to turn this around is questionable. I don't know if it's even possible that an American president has the power to turn it around, even if he wanted to. But more and more, we're getting in a position where those who are running or wanting to run for office and live and actually be leaders and do the right thing, they are not even able to become a candidate, period. And if they do become a candidate, they're marginalized. And we saw Ralph Nader, for instance, who ran for president a couple of times, completely marginalized, unable even to participate in the debates. We saw Ron Paul, who was allowed in as a longtime establishment Republican, you know, tremendously long number of years in Congress, allowed to actually stand with the other candidates and participate in the debates, but not ask the questions. I mean, given a very, very brief attention from the questioner, as if he didn't really matter. And then he would speak up and tell the truth like he always does. And it's extremely unsettling for those people in their comfort zone to listen to Ron Paul. But the people who were in the audience screamed with joy whenever Ron Paul would be allowed to speak. And yet, did he have a chance? No. And everyone knew he did not have a chance, that he would not be given a chance to run to actually become a candidate for president. Because those days are past. They're not going to give up their power to someone who wants, for instance, to shut down the Federal Reserve banking and go to a whole new banking system, which is honest and straightforward. And for the fat cats and the banks to take the hit that is required, and those on Wall Street to take the hit that is required to turn it around, to turn the situation around. The situation is dire in the country, and it's a worldwide phenomenon. The criminality of the banks and the leadership and the manufacturing and the military all working together for their own best interests. We oftentimes hear the term American interests when we're talking in terms of invading a country or bombing a country, but these are not the American people's interest. These are the people who are actually doing the bombing and providing the weapons for the bombing, and the rockets and the airplanes and the ships and all the other military gear and all the associated oil companies and so on. All these people have interests in doing this. But the American people gain no benefit. And I wanted to talk to you about an important secret, you could say, that is part of American history now, but it's, again, suppressed. Like so oftentimes, this kind of history gets suppressed. We have to think of the history of the car. The car was invented around the turn of the century, around 1900 or so, 1905, 1910, around there it started to come in. And Henry Ford built his popular Ford Model T, and it got maybe 20 miles a gallon, and it putted along at 40 miles an hour or something like that. And right now we have cars in 2015, 100 years later, which can go faster, but really still only get between 20 and 30 miles a gallon, 35 maybe, your average car. And you have to think, in 100 years of technology, is this the only gas savings that we have been able to come up with in technology? When we know that only about 17 to 20%, I've heard 17%, of the gas that is squirted into the firing chamber on an internal combustion engine is actually ignited and burned and is translated into energy to run that vehicle. The rest goes out as air pollution out the tailpipe. And this is my understanding, is that gasoline is extremely inefficient in terms of being able to burn. Now, why is that? I can remember when I had my first car, and it was a 1958 Chevrolet, and for some reason, I wanted to look into Was it the intake manifold or the carburetor? But I used a match, and I was trying to get some light down into that carburetor. And guess what happened? An intense, boom, explosion happened, and it singed my eyebrows. And I learned, oh, holy Moses, those fumes are really, really volatile. They are flammable, really flammable. They ignite really easily. And we know that that's how gasoline burns. It's the fumes that ignite. Well, what people have been trying to say, what inventors have been trying to do for many, many decades, and they've done it successfully, strangely enough, is to create a way in which the fumes can be used as to their fullest without adding the droplets. The droplets are sprayed into the firing chamber. It's a squirt, 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 squirt. That's what a car does. It's squirting a mist of droplets into the firing chamber, which ignite. Except most of those don't ignite. And they, like I said, go out the tailpipe. They're just not igniting. And a mist, or a vapor I should say, is made up of, I guess, molecules, and they burnt 100% clean. And that's what happened with me with the match, and the boom. It was a powerful little explosion there that startled me. And now the first person that I've read about, I've been doing some research on this, was named Charles Nelson Pogue. And he, in the 20s and into the 30s, he invented a carburetor that would only allow the fumes into the firing chamber. And he demonstrated that his car, which was a heavy old car, but they were very heavy back in those days, could get 100 miles a gallon or more. And he demonstrated this running on fumes from gasoline. And then, and what happened to that? He attracted the interest of oil companies, of car manufacturers from around the world. He became almost instant celebrity. He sold out his patent to his invention, and he sold it to, I'm not sure who he sold it to, I forget, an oil company or a car manufacturer, and we never saw that invention again. And then he was interviewed, and I read the interview, the transcript, and they would say, the interviewer would go, well, what do you think about, what happened to your invention after you sold it out for $1 million or whatever it was? What are your thoughts on that? And he says, I don't want to talk about it. Well, doesn't that bother you? I don't want to talk about it. What about, I heard that your invention, it's dangerous, it could explode. He got really pissed off at that. So, that's not true. That's totally not true. That's a lie. It was completely safe. But that was the way mostly the interview went, is like, he was afraid. He was afraid. He was intimidated. Somebody threatened him. And then, okay, so he drops out of the picture. He becomes an obscure figure. Then, 5, 10 years later, someone else invents something similar. The same thing happens to them. Then in the 40s, the same thing happens to them. Then in the 50s, someone else. I saw it interview with a guy who'd been studying this all his life. He had a book, and he had a list of the names and dates for the various, and each time there was this flurry of interest. The Saudi Arabians even interested in getting it, and would paying millions sometimes for the invention that was patented. The patent numbers are there. Essentially the same invention, which is a very simple add-on to a internal combustion engine, can be put on almost any car. It doesn't matter if it's a carburetor or fuel injection now. But the most famous one that I was reading was Tom Ogle. Tom Ogle lived in El Paso, Texas. He was a young guy, and he was kind of a whiz at car mechanics. And he came up with this system that he called a filter. It was an add-on, and it essentially bypassed the carburetor. He had a 1970 Ford Galaxy, big heavy car, almost 4,000 pounds. And he demonstrated that that car got 100 miles a gallon using his system, which bypassed the carburetor, essentially, and allowed the fumes from the gas to go into the firing chamber. And how would that work? You have to heat the gas. And you also have a pressurized tank, gas tank. What he did was, he found out there was so much suction, the engine was running on the fumes, but the suction just crushed the gas tank in the Ford Galaxy. So they had to build another gas tank that was really strong. And can you imagine? A Ford Galaxy is a very heavy car with a huge engine by today's standards. By today's standards, you could probably get 200, 300, 400 miles a gallon using this system of running on vapor. And what happened with Tom Ogle was that he patented it, had a lot of interest from the big boys. He sold out. He got all this money. He was going to get royalties. He had a deal going like this, and all of a sudden the whole thing went nowhere, to hell. It went down into the memory hole, disappeared. The invention gone. He can't do it. He doesn't have the patent. He sold the patent. Then his wife leaves him. He becomes a drunk. He dies at 28. We see this kind of pattern over and over with other inventors too, with different systems. I'm just talking about just one system, but it's a very simple and basic system that still uses gasoline. The question is, why would oil companies and why would car manufacturers be against this? This is an incredible innovation, but we have to consider that if cars in America and the whole world are using this system and they're getting 200 miles a gallon, that means that the oil companies cannot make any money, because you don't need to buy their product very often, not very often, and they're not possibly going to be able to make a profit, because to refine oil is expensive into gasoline. You've seen the huge oil refineries, very complex process, supposedly, I guess. So they're worried about their profits. And that's why they're in business, to make profit. They're not in business to create necessarily the most efficient use of their product, because if the product is used efficiently, really efficiently, they make less money. So they want to make the appearance that they're creating more efficient cars, but without really doing it. And we saw this with the difference between the carburetor and the fuel injection system. They introduced the fuel injection system, in the 80s, did away with the carburetor. We were told that the fuel injection system was going to dramatically increase gas consumption, or decrease gas consumption. But it really didn't. It really didn't make that much of a difference. The carburetor is almost as good. So they won't use the technology. And people find this hard to believe, that this could be true. Oh, it must have been a hoax. But there's been if that's the case, then there's been a whole series of hoaxes. Get online. Watch the young guys, mostly young guys, not always young guys, who make these devices very similar to Charles Nelson Pogue's and Tom Ogle's device and put it on their cars, and they demonstrate it. They'll put it on YouTube, and here's how it works. But guess what? They can't patent them because people try to patent these, and the oil companies or the car companies that own the patents will say, but you're infringing on our patent. We already have this device. Here it is right here. And you're clearly, here, this aspect of what you're doing, it's almost identical to this patent that we already have. Remember, they've been buying up patents for what, 80 years for this particular one device, and then just sitting on them and not using them? And they control that. They control that now. You can't sell that device because it'd be patent infringement. So what you could do is you could make it, if you were clever enough and understood the processes, which is not that difficult to do. There's different guys. Some guys make really complicated ones with all these bells and whistles. Other guys make real simple ones, but they work. They can't sell them. They can't patent them. They're already patented. So here is the world of Fantasyland that we live in. It is all smoke and mirrors, folks, very often. The reality of what we think is progress and science and human development, and that we're all in this together and we're marching into the future. Not true. There are people out there who are deliberately trying to keep us from marching into the future. And this is not the only example. This is only one example of how development is deliberately held back. This is the world we live in. And, you know, I'm sure there's people who watch this, that's stupid, that could never happen. Running on fumes, 200 miles a gallon, 300, 400 miles a gallon. But check it out for yourself. There's all kinds of pretty convincing evidence. I mean, think about it. Think of the power of the fumes, the volatility of the fumes from gasoline. And also the fact that the gasoline that we're using now is very, very polluting to the atmosphere. And I have to think of the ramifications of something like this. If cars were getting 400 miles, these little cars we drive today, were getting 400 miles a gallon, what would be the ramifications? Would we need to have wars for oil? Would we need very much oil? Would cancer levels go down? I think it would. And other illnesses that are related to oil, pollution from cars, asthma, you name it, all kinds of things. Pollution from refineries, water pollution, air pollution, people who live near refineries. Endless ramifications here. People worry about the climate change, global warming, getting out CO2. They worry about CO2. CO2, when you have a clean burning vehicle, it burns, that vapor is burned everything. All, like, even the lead in the old, like Tom Ogle in those days, they had lead in the gasoline. Apparently the lead would also burn. Well, lead, if you get on the molecular level, it's going to burn. It's going to burn too. Went down to that level, boom, it's gone. And so here we are in a world that's racked by war, that is beneficial to a few. We have a world in which technology is selectively used and developed. I mean, you take the example of Tesla, Nikola Tesla. Tesla was marginalized at the end of his life to such an extent that he was almost expunged from existence. Nikola Tesla, by some people considered to be the greatest inventor who ever lived. Much of what we see and we live, the way we live now, was originally envisioned by Tesla. Envisioned, and the first primary steps in the development were taken. He was a visionary inventor. What he would do was, he would come up with the concept, he would design the beginnings of the concept, and then others would take it from there. And he actually gave away some of his patents. He had so many patents. And he was quite wealthy for quite a long time. But he gave away so many. He was ripped off by so many people. He didn't get the royalties that he should have been getting. He should have been the wealthiest man in the world by rights. But instead, he dies alone and forgotten in a hotel room. His name almost completely expunged from the history books. I learned all about Edison, Thomas Edison, when I was in high school. Grade school, you learn about Thomas Edison. But where was the name of Tesla? Nowhere. I don't remember. Maybe that's changed since when I was young. Maybe they have given, and they probably have, given Tesla more of his due. But it was partly because he was kind of a victim of the system in a way. He was just too bright. He had come up with a way of transmitting energy wirelessly. Not almost too bright, but he was definitely too bright. He was becoming a danger. He was supported by Morgan, J.P. Morgan, and who was all for it. But then when Tesla said, hey, I want to give the whole world free energy, and I have a method to do it, to use the magnetism of the planet to draw energy from, the vibration of the planet, and transmit it wirelessly free to everyone. Then J.P. Morgan, he was like, no way. Where's the profit in that? And he shut Tesla down. He withdrew his funding. All these rumors were starting to be promulgated about how Tesla was crazy, believed in Martians, was a nutcase, and it worked. Because the rich, greedy, fat cat didn't want the whole world to have free energy. Well, that's all I have for today, so have a great weekend and sleep well.